when 5 orphan girls knocked on Silas McKinnon's door during the worst blizzard in Montana Territory history. He had every reason to turn them away. The weathered rancher had spent 3 years building walls around his heart after losing the only woman he'd ever loved, and the last thing he wanted was responsibility for anyone else's pain. But sometimes God sends angels in the most unexpected forms, and sometimes the people we save end up saving us instead. Silas McKinnon had once been known throughout the Bitterroot Valley as a man who could make anything grow in the harsh Montana soil. His ranch, the Double S Spread, had been legendary for producing the finest cattle and horses in the territory. But more than that, it had been famous as a place where hope flourished even in the hardest seasons. Neighbors for 50 miles around would come to Silas when their own crops failed or their livestock sickened, knowing that Stone McKinnon could work miracles with patience, determination, and an almost supernatural understanding of the land. The nickname Stone hadn't come from hardness of heart, as most people assumed after 1881. Originally, it had been a reference to Silas's unshakable reliability, his ability to stand firm against any storm that life could throw at him. When other ranchers panicked during droughts or harsh winters, Silas would remain calm and methodical, finding solutions where others saw only problems. When rustlers or hostile tribes threatened the valley, Silas would organize the defense with the steady competence of a man who never doubted his ability to protect what mattered to him. But all of that had changed on a crisp October morning in 1881 when consumption finally claimed his beloved wife, Rebecca. They had been married for 12 years, and every single day of those years had felt like a gift to Silas. Rebecca had been the kind of woman who could make a rough frontier cabin feel like the finest mansion simply by being in it. She had possessed a laugh that could chase away the darkest moods, hands that could heal both people and animals, and a faith in God and humanity that seemed unshakable even in the face of the countless hardships that frontier life imposed. Rebecca had also been barren, a fact that had caused her deep sorrow despite Silas's constant reassurance that she was all the family he needed. They had tried for years to have children, consulting every doctor within 300 miles and following every folk remedy that well-meaning friends suggested. Each month that passed without pregnancy had broken Rebecca's heart a little more, and each of her tears had felt like a dagger in Silas's chest. When the consumption began stealing Rebecca's strength, Silas had fought it with the same determination he brought to every other challenge. He had taken her to specialists in Denver and San Francisco, spending every dollar he had and mortgaging his ranch to pay for treatments that promised hope but delivered only temporary reprieve. He had nursed her through 2 terrible winters, watching helplessly as the disease slowly consumed the vibrant woman he loved more than his own life. Rebecca had died holding his hand and whispering that she was sorry for leaving him alone in such a hard world. Her last words had been a request that Silas not let grief turn his heart to actual stone, that he remember how much joy they had shared and try to find ways to honor that joy even after she was gone. But as Silas stood at her graveside in the small cemetery outside Missoula, watching dirt cover the simple wooden coffin that held all his hopes for happiness, he felt something inside himself simply shut down. The 3 years that followed Rebecca's death had transformed Silas from one of the most respected men in the territory into a hermit who barely spoke to his neighbors and never smiled. He continued working his ranch with mechanical efficiency, but the passion and innovation that had once made the Double S legendary had disappeared entirely. He kept his cattle alive and his fences mended, but he no longer experimented with new breeding techniques or helped struggling neighbors solve their problems. Most telling of all, Silas had stopped attending church and community gatherings, couldn't bear to be around families with children, and had essentially cut himself off from all human connection except the minimal interaction required to conduct business. His foreman, old Pete Martinez, and a handful of ranch hands who still worked for him had learned to communicate mostly through nods and gestures, understanding that their boss had retreated to a place where words seemed to cause him physical pain. The ranch itself reflected Silas's emotional state. Buildings that had once been meticulously maintained now showed signs of neglect. The flower garden that Rebecca had tended with such love had been allowed to go to weeds. The big house that had once welcomed visitors with warmth and hospitality now stood shuttered and silent, with Silas living in just 2 rooms and leaving the rest to gather dust and memories too painful to confront. By the winter of 1884, even old Pete was beginning to worry that his boss might not survive another year of self-imposed isolation. Silas had grown gaunt and gray, eating barely enough to keep himself alive and working himself to exhaustion as if physical pain might somehow distract him from the deeper agony that consumed his soul. The man who had once been the spiritual anchor of the entire valley had become a ghost haunting his own life. The blizzard that changed everything began on December 18th, 1884, with winds that howled down from Canada, carrying snow so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. This wasn't the kind of storm that frontier people could prepare for adequately. It was the kind of weather that killed cattle in their tracks, collapsed buildings under the weight of snow, and turned simple journeys into death traps for anyone caught in the open. Silas had spent 2 days battling the storm, struggling to keep his animals alive and his buildings intact. He had lost 12 head of cattle to the cold and was beginning to worry that the remaining herd might not survive if the storm continued much longer. By the evening of December 20th, he was exhausted, discouraged, and seriously considering whether it might be time to give up ranching entirely and try to find some other way to pass the remaining years of his life. He was sitting by his fire, staring into the flames and remembering other winter evenings when Rebecca had sat beside him reading aloud or working on her needlepoint, when he heard something that seemed impossible given the conditions outside. Someone was knocking on his door. Not the tentative tapping of a lost traveler, hoping for directions, but the desperate pounding of people in genuine distress. Silas opened the door to find 5 girls huddled together on his porch, ranging in age from maybe 6 to 16, all of them blue with cold and obviously near collapse from exhaustion and exposure. They were dressed in thin clothing that was completely inadequate for the brutal weather, and the oldest girl was carrying the youngest in her arms while the others clung to her skirts as if she were their only anchor in a hostile world. "Please, mister," the oldest girl gasped through chattering teeth. "We need help. Our wagon broke down about 2 miles back, and our horses ran off. We've been walking for hours, and I think little Sarah might be dying." Without hesitation, Silas scooped up the smallest child and ushered all 5 girls into his cabin. The youngest, who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, was indeed in serious danger from hypothermia. Her lips were purple, her breathing was shallow, and she was barely conscious. Silas immediately began the process of warming her gradually while asking the older girls what had happened to bring them out in such terrible conditions. The story they told was heartbreaking in its familiarity. The girls were orphans from the St. Mary's Home for Children in Helena, being transported to new placements with families in Missoula when the blizzard had caught them in the open. Their escort, a well-meaning but inexperienced young woman from the orphanage, had made several poor decisions that had ultimately led to disaster. She had ignored warnings about the approaching storm, taken a shortcut that led them away from established roads, and panicked when their wagon broke an axle and their horses spooked and ran away. Miss Jennifer tried to go for help, explained the oldest girl, who introduced herself as Catherine. She told us to stay with the wagon, but after she'd been gone for 6 hours and the storm kept getting worse, I knew we had to find shelter ourselves. I picked up Sarah and told the others to follow me, and we just started walking. Silas learned that the woman who had been escorting them had actually frozen to death attempting to find help. Her body discovered 3 days later by a search party. The girls had been walking through the storm for more than 8 hours, with Catherine carrying Sarah most of the way while the other 3 girls, who were between 8 and 12 years old, struggled through snow that was often deeper than they were tall. As Silas worked to warm the girls and get some hot food into them, he found himself remembering skills that he hadn't used since Rebecca's illness. He knew how to treat hypothermia, how to recognize the signs of frostbite, and how to care for children who were scared and traumatized. More importantly, he found himself genuinely caring about their welfare in a way that surprised him with its intensity. The youngest girl, Sarah, had indeed been close to death from exposure. It took Silas most of the night to bring her body temperature back to normal, and for hours he wasn't sure she would survive. He sat beside her bed, applying warm compresses and monitoring her breathing, while the other girls slept fitfully in chairs around his fire. It was the longest night Silas had experienced since Rebecca's final illness, and he found himself praying for the first time in 3 years. As dawn broke and the storm finally began to subside, Sarah opened her eyes and smiled at Silas with the innocent trust that only small children can display towards someone who has shown them kindness. "Are you my new papa?" she asked in a voice that was still weak, but clearly on the path to recovery. The question hit Silas like a physical blow. He had never been anyone's papa, had given up hope of ever having that role in his life, and the casual way this little girl offered him that title felt like a door opening in his heart that he had thought was sealed forever. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'm just someone who wants to help you feel better." Over the next 3 days, while they waited for the roads to clear enough for travel to Missoula, Silas found himself experiencing emotions that he had forgotten he was capable of feeling. The girls brought an energy and purpose to his house that had been missing for years. Catherine, who was 16 and remarkably mature for her age, helped him care for the younger ones with a competence that spoke of years of practice. The middle girls, Mary, Elizabeth, and Rose, filled his usually silent home with chatter, questions, and laughter that seemed to chase away shadows that had lingered too long in every corner. But it was little Sarah who affected him most profoundly. She attached herself to Silas with the wholehearted devotion that children reserve for those they instinctively trust, following him around the house, asking endless questions about ranch life, and insisting on helping with every task, no matter how small her contribution might be. When she fell asleep each night, she would curl up against his side like a kitten seeking warmth, and Silas found himself staying awake just to watch her peaceful face and remember what it felt like to be needed by someone who depended on his protection. The girls told him stories about their lives at the orphanage, about the families they had lost to disease, accident, and hardship, and about their hopes for finding new homes where they might finally belong. Catherine had been at St. Mary's for 6 years, since her parents died of smallpox when she was 10. The middle girls had various tragic histories involving parents killed in mining accidents, mothers who died in childbirth, and fathers who simply disappeared when frontier life became too difficult to bear. Sarah's story was the most heartbreaking of all. She had been found as an infant on the steps of a church in Butte, with only a note from her mother saying that she couldn't care for a child and hoped someone else could give the baby a better life. Sarah had no memory of any family except the other girls at the orphanage, and her greatest fear was that she would be separated from Catherine, who had been like a mother to her for as long as she could remember. As the days passed and the roads began to clear, Silas found himself dreading the moment when he would have to take the girls to Missoula and hand them over to the authorities who would decide their fate. He had learned that Catherine was considered too old for adoption and would likely be sent to work as a domestic servant somewhere. The middle girls might find families, but there was no guarantee they would be placed together or treated with kindness. And little Sarah, despite her sweet nature, was considered a difficult placement because of her age and the fact that she refused to be separated from Catherine. The night before they were scheduled to leave for Missoula, Silas lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about Rebecca's last words. She had asked him not to let grief turn his heart to stone, to remember the joy they had shared and find ways to honor that joy. For 3 years, he had been unable to imagine what she might have meant, but now he thought he understood. The joy he had shared with Rebecca hadn't been just about their love for each other, though that had been the foundation of everything. It had been about creating a home where love could flourish, about building something lasting and meaningful, about making the world a little bit better through their presence in it. He had stopped doing all of those things when Rebecca died, but these 5 girls had reminded him that the capacity for love and creation still existed within him. When morning came, instead of hitching up his wagon to take the girls to town, Silas sat them down around his kitchen table and made a proposal that surprised even himself. "I've been thinking about something all night," he began, his voice rough with emotion he was struggling to control. "This ranch is too big for one man, and I'm too old to be living alone. I was wondering if you girls might consider staying here permanently. Not as temporary guests, but as family." The silence that followed his words was broken by Sarah's delighted squeal of, "I knew you were my new papa," followed by Catherine's more cautious response. "Mr. McKinnon, that's very kind of you, but we're not exactly what most people consider a normal family. Are you sure you understand what you're offering?" Silas looked around the table at the 5 faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from hope to disbelief to pure joy, and he felt his heart opening in ways that had seemed impossible just a week earlier. "Catherine, I've learned this week that families aren't always made the traditional way. Sometimes they're made by people who need each other and choose to take care of each other. If you girls are willing to take a chance on a grumpy old rancher who's forgotten how to smile, I'd like to try being the father you deserve." The legal process of adopting 5 orphan girls was complicated by the fact that frontier territories had limited bureaucratic infrastructure and even more limited precedent for such unusual situations. Silas had to travel to Helena to meet with territorial officials, convince skeptical authorities that he was capable of caring for 5 children, and demonstrate that he had the financial resources to support such a large family. The officials at St. Mary's Home were initially resistant to the idea, partly because they had never dealt with a single man wanting to adopt 5 children simultaneously, and partly because they had concerns about whether an isolated ranch was an appropriate environment for girls who would need education and socialization. It took letters of recommendation from every prominent citizen in the Bitterroot Valley, plus a formal inspection of his ranch by territorial social workers, before the adoption was finally approved. But the most significant obstacle came from an unexpected source. Word of Silas's plan had reached the ears of several families in Missoula who had been interested in adopting one or more of the girls individually. These families argued that it would be better for the children to be placed in traditional family situations rather than in an experimental arrangement with a bachelor rancher who had no experience raising children. The controversy came to a head during a formal hearing in Helena, where Silas had to defend his fitness as a parent and argue for his right to keep the girls together as a family unit. The families opposing the adoption presented compelling arguments about the importance of traditional family structures and the questionable wisdom of allowing an unmarried man to raise 5 girls without proper female supervision. Silas's response to these challenges surprised everyone present, including himself. Standing before the territorial judge, he spoke with a passion and eloquence that he hadn't displayed since Rebecca's death, explaining that the girls had already formed bonds with each other that transcended traditional family relationships, and that separating them would cause unnecessary trauma to children who had already experienced too much loss. "Your Honor," Silas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once made him a natural leader in his community, "these girls have been taking care of each other for years. Catherine has been a mother to Sarah since she was barely more than a child herself. Mary, Elizabeth, and Rose have learned to find strength in their unity. They're not just 5 individual children who happen to need homes. They're already a family, and they're asking me to be part of that family rather than the other way around." The judge was ultimately swayed, not by Silas's arguments, but by the testimony of the girls themselves. When Catherine was called to speak, she stood before the court with dignity beyond her 16 years and explained that she and her sisters had found something in Silas's house that they had never experienced at the orphanage, the feeling of being truly wanted rather than merely tolerated. "Mr. McKinnon doesn't want to adopt us because he feels sorry for us," Catherine explained. "He wants us to be his family because we make each other happy. We've never had that before, and we're not willing to give it up just because it doesn't look like what other people think a family should look like." The adoption was finalized on March 15, 1885, making Silas McKinnon the legal father of 5 daughters ranging in age from 7 to 17. The ceremony was held in the territorial courthouse in Helena, with old Pete Martinez and several of Silas's neighbors serving as witnesses. When the judge pronounced them officially a family, little Sarah ran to Silas and hugged him around the waist, declaring loudly that she had always known he was her real papa and that now it was finally true. The transformation that followed the adoption was remarkable to witness. Silas threw himself into the role of father with the same determination he had once brought to ranching, learning everything he could about child development, education, and the particular needs of girls growing up on the frontier. He hired a tutor from back east to ensure that all 5 girls received proper education, and he converted one of his unused barns into a schoolhouse where other children from neighboring ranches could also receive instruction. More importantly, Silas began rebuilding the sense of community that had once made his ranch a gathering place for the entire valley. The big house that had stood empty and silent for years was once again filled with voices, laughter, and the countless activities that come with raising 5 active children. Sunday dinners became legendary throughout the territory, with neighbors traveling for hours just to experience the warmth and hospitality that the McKinnon family offered to anyone who visited. The girls each brought their own unique contributions to the family's success. Catherine, who had essentially been a mother since childhood, became Silas's partner in managing the household and ensuring that her younger sisters received the guidance they needed. Mary, who had a natural talent for dealing with animals, became invaluable in the ranch's horse breeding program. Elizabeth showed an aptitude for bookkeeping that helped Silas modernize his business practices, while Rose demonstrated artistic talents that she used to beautify their home and create items that could be sold to supplement the family's income. And little Sarah, who had attached herself to Silas from that first night, became his constant companion and a source of joy that reminded him daily why life was worth living. She followed him around the ranch, asking endless questions, helped with chores that were far too big for her small hands, and filled his previously silent house with songs, stories, and the pure delight that children find in simple pleasures. The success of the McKinnon family became a source of inspiration throughout the Montana Territory and beyond. Newspaper articles were written about the bachelor rancher who had adopted 5 orphan girls and created one of the most successful and respected families in the region. Social reformers pointed to the McKinnons as proof that non-traditional families could thrive when built on genuine love and mutual commitment rather than social convention. But for Silas, the most meaningful recognition came from sources much closer to home. His neighbors, who had watched him retreat from life after Rebecca's death, marveled at his transformation from bitter hermit to devoted father. Old Pete Martinez, who had worked for Silas for 15 years, often remarked that he had never seen a man change so completely or find such obvious happiness in circumstances that most people would have considered overwhelming. The ranch itself reflected the family's success and happiness. Buildings that had been neglected during Silas's years of grief were restored and improved. The house was expanded to accommodate 5 growing girls, with each daughter eventually having her own room decorated according to her individual personality and interests. Rebecca's flower garden was replanted and expanded, becoming a showplace that attracted visitors from across the territory who came to see what could be accomplished with patience, dedication, and love. As the girls grew into young women, each found her own path while remaining connected to the family that had given them their first experience of unconditional love. Catherine married a young lawyer from Missoula and became an advocate for orphan children throughout the territory, using her own experience to help improve conditions for children in institutional care. Mary took over much of the ranch's daily operations and eventually inherited Silas's gift for breeding exceptional horses. Elizabeth moved to Denver to pursue her interest in business, but returned every summer with her own family to help with the ranch and maintain the connections that had sustained her through childhood. Rose became a teacher and established schools in several frontier communities, always emphasizing the importance of creating environments where children could feel safe and valued regardless of their backgrounds. And Sarah, who had been closest to Silas from the beginning, chose to remain on the ranch permanently, eventually marrying one of the neighboring ranchers and raising her own children in the house, where she had first learned what it meant to be part of a loving family. Her children grew up calling Silas Grandpa and learning from him the same lessons about love, commitment, and community that had transformed 5 orphan girls into confident, capable women. Silas lived to be 78 years old, passing away peacefully in 1902, surrounded by his 5 daughters, their families, and the dozens of grandchildren who had brought him joy in his final years. His funeral was attended by more than 500 people, including territorial officials, successful business leaders, and countless families whose lives have been touched by the McKinnon family's example of what could be accomplished through love and determination. The eulogy at Silas's funeral was delivered by Catherine, now a respected community leader in her own right, who spoke about the man who had saved 5 orphan girls but had ultimately been saved by them in return. Our father taught us that families aren't defined by blood or convention, but by the choice to love each other unconditionally and support each other through every challenge life presents. He showed us that even the deepest grief can be transformed into purpose, and that sometimes the people we rescue end up rescuing us. The Double S Ranch remained in the McKinnon family for generations, eventually becoming a working museum that tells the story of the bachelor rancher who adopted 5 orphan girls and proved that love is the most powerful force for transformation in the human experience. Visitors to the ranch can still see the schoolhouse where the girls received their education, the expanded house where they grew up feeling safe and valued, and Rebecca's flower garden, which continues to bloom every spring as a testament to the enduring power of hope and renewal. Today, the story of Silas McKinnon and his 5 daughters is remembered throughout Montana as proof that families come in many forms, and that the greatest successes in life often come from the courage to open our hearts to unexpected possibilities. It reminds us that sometimes the people who need rescuing the most are the ones who think they're beyond help, and that love has the power to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities when it's given freely and without conditions.